But yeah, in this final class, um we'll cover the final unit, which is ecology. And because this is a quicker unit, we'll spend more of the time solving some like FRQs and more multiple choice questions before your test. So yeah, ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms and their environment. So mostly before this point, we've been focusing on like the organismal level. So like we're focusing on individual organisms, whether that be like cells or like how we go from DNA to genes, etc., and also populations. But today we will be focusing a lot more on like how organisms interact with their environment as a whole. And sort of as a sub like part of ecology is often included as ethology. So ethology is the study of animal behavior specifically and how animals make choices based on their environment. So some of you might have done the pill bug lab in AP biology this year. So in the pill bug lab, you like put pill bugs in like a box with two different chambers. One side is light and the other side is dark. And so the pill bugs will move, or they will eventually generally tend to end up on the darker side, because obviously if they're on the darker side, they can like pill bugs like natural habitat is like being under logs and stuff. So they also prefer to like stay in the dark to avoid predators and also avoid dehydration. But yeah, so pill bugs are an example of kinesis. So taxis is a directed movement of an organism in response to an environmental stimulus, while kinesis is the undirected movement. So taxis means they like have a specific goal in mind and they like get closer to the goal. Kinesis, on the other hand, so for example, for pill bugs just move more in when it's light out versus when it's dark out. So just by random chance, if they move like more and faster when they sense more light, then they will like eventually hopefully end up in a dark place where they will move less and then stay there for longer. So you can remember this by taxis sounds like taxis, which like take you to a destination, versus kinesis just means like moving around in general. We also have fixed action patterns, which are a sequence of events instinctively performed to assign stimulus. So for example, male stickleback fish behave aggressively to the color red because that basically means there's another male stickleback fish. So they will like try to like fight for resources and mates with the other male. But specifically, the way they recognize the other male is by looking at like this red patch on the bottom. So all males have red bellies. So that means if any male stickleback fish sees any like object with a red patch on the bottom, even if it's like, for example, this is clearly not a fish, but just because it has the red on the bottom, this is the sign stimulus that then causes a fixed action pattern, which is behaving aggressively. So yeah, it's just like something activates this sequence of actions and then they behave it instinctively in accordance with the sign stimulus. So yeah, this is something that they are born like knowing to do, and they cannot change this behavior. On the other hand, many animals do in fact like learn different things. So learning refers to like acquiring new information and then changing your behavior based on it, rather than like the male stickleback fish, which was born with this instinctive like aggression when they see the color red. So for example, imprinting refers to a specific type of long-lasting learning that can only happen within a critical period. So if you've ever seen like baby ducklings following around their mother, so if you were beside like the eggs when they hatched, these young ducklings probably would have imprinted, as we'd say, on you, and then they would think that you are their parents. So yeah, it's specific long-lasting learning. So for example, learning who your parent is, that can only happen within a critical period. So for these, it's like a few minutes after birth. If it doesn't happen within the critical period, then this learning like sort of can't ever be redone. And then other types of learning include spatial learning, associative learning, and social learning. And they are exactly what they sound like. So like learning how to associate things with each other or learning how things exist in space. And then finally, we have habituation, which is sort of like becoming used to a stimulus. So for example, like if someone like starts vacuuming at first, you'll be like very annoyed, but if you have to like sit there for a long period of time, eventually you might like not even notice the noise anymore. So that's an example of habituation. You get used to a stimulus and then the stimulus affects you less and less. And then finally, we have animal communication, which can come in many different formats. So it can be visual, it can be like auditory, it can also be like chemical. So for example, lots of like insects, for instance, release pheromones in order to like find, for example, yeah, like different ants will release pheromones in order to like make tracks and like be able to find their way back to the nest. Other insects, such as bees, use a waggle dance to communicate the location of nectar. And then also animals also have like different societal structures. So for example, bees live in a hive where there is one female called the queen that lays all the eggs. And the other like worker bees are non-reproductive, but they sort of just like maintain the nest and like care for the young and stuff like that. On the other hand, like for example, in these deer, it's like many males competing for like mating rights. So agonistic behavior is aggressive behavior generally in like males for competition for resources such as territory or mates. Does anybody have any questions on animal behavior? Okay, next we'll move on to population ecology. So yeah, as you know, a population is a group of the same species. And so we can track like different like things about population numbers, such as like the change in population number in general with this equation. Because population number is just affected by births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. So immigration, the I stands for in, emigration, the E is like X, which like means going out. So yeah, if there are births or immigrants, obviously the population will increase, and then deaths or immigrants, then the population will decrease. So the change in population can be calculated with this formula. And if you divide it by the total population at the start, then it will be like the percent change or the proportional change in population. But besides just population number, we'd also like to know more about the population structure of a specific population. So a cohort is a group of individuals that are all the same age. So for example, all sixth graders or all people who were born in 2018, for instance. And we can use these one of these things that like we would like to know about a cohort is we would like to know what percent of a cohort is still alive at a certain age. And if we can gather that data, then we can plot it on a chart that often looks like this. Notice that this is a log scale. But yeah, so like number of survivors or percent of survivors that are still alive at a certain age. So obviously at the start, at the very, very birth, everyone is assumed to be alive. But like, yeah, then over time and eventually like the curve will reach a point at which it's zero. So everyone has to die at some point. But the trajectory it takes in between is sort of representative of the species and like it's sort of like just general life strategy. So for example, humans are what we say type 1 survivorship curves, which means our curve like stays like high for very long, and at the end is when it like tapers off. There's type 2 where it's sort of like a flat slope down. And then finally, type 3, it's a sharp drop at the beginning, but then it flattens out at the end. But yeah, so what this corresponds to for type 1 is like, for type 1, most of the death is later in life, versus for things like type 3, most of the death is early in life. And then those who survive past adolescence generally live a long time. And for type 2, it means that the death rate is constant no matter where you are in life. And you can also see some species that are correlated. So for example, humans, most humans tend to die in old age, at least nowadays, with like better medicine and stuff like that. Versus for things like trees, or like this oak tree, it'll drop tons and tons of acorns, but most of the acorns will not even be able to like germinate. So therefore, like the drop off is very fast at the start. But once like a tree grows into like a mature tree, it's like sort of hard to kill it, and then it will survive for a long time. And some closely related terms with this are R strategists and K strategists. So organism with type 3 survivorship curves tend to be R strategists. You can remember R for reproduction, meaning they produce a lot of offspring, but don't give a lot of parental care. So yeah, this oak tree produced a ton of acorns, but for each acorn, it's on its own. On the other hand, K strategists generally correlate with type 1 survivorship curves. It means they produce a few offspring, but invest a lot of energy in each one. So an example is humans and many other large mammals. We only have a few children, but we like put a lot of energy to feed it and protect it and like stuff like that before it can like finally mature and be independent. So R strategic and K strategist is not like it falls into one of two categories. It's more like a spectrum. So you can see like oysters are like on the pretty R strategist side, but like some things are in the middle. So like frogs and hares. Now, if we'd like to track the growth of our population throughout time, we can graph it on like this type of graph. And in an environment with infinite resources, populations follow the exponential growth model, otherwise known as the J-shaped curve. But yeah, so if you think of like a bacteria doubling every hour, so it would be like go 1, 2, 4, 8, and like you can see it like go speeds up and speeds up, and that means over time the population will grow to infinity. So yeah, for exponential growth, just like know that it's like, oh yeah, in math class you might have like heard of like some constant to the t power, or yeah, something around this, or like maybe it's e to the some constant times t times another constant out in front. But yeah, exponential curves are of this like form where the time variable is in the exponent. And so for example, here's a like a basic exponential growth problem to calculate the population size of a population of yeast that doubles every 4 hours. So if it doubles every 4 hours, then after 24 hours, it will have doubled 6 times. So you'd multiply by 2 to the 6th. On the other hand, in the real world, resources are limited. So each environment has a carrying capacity. And the logistic growth model describes how growth slows and levels off at the carrying capacity. But the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that environment can sustain without like having a decrease in like, yeah, have like sustain like for the long term. So if the population happens to be above the carrying capacity at a certain point, which it can be, it just means that in the future, it will probably like go back down towards the carrying capacity. But yeah, we call the logistic growth model the S-shaped curve, and it looks something like this. So it starts off looking pretty similar to the exponential curve, but then around the middle, it starts to like switch and like level off. So the fastest growth rate would be like 1 is exactly half of the carrying capacity. But yeah, so also this is still idealized. Obviously, in real life, populations might like overshoot the carrying capacity and then fall back down and then oscillate around the carrying capacity. So it's not like they stay exactly on the carrying capacity. They'll like sometimes be a bit above and then that will cause them to like crash. But then the next season they'll be a bit too below, which will cause them to like jump back up, but then they'll be a bit too above. So et cetera, et cetera. And factors that limit population size can be density independent, for example, the weather, or density dependent, like disease or predation. So density independent means that it affects it regardless of whether the population is like very dense or not. So examples are generally weather phenomena such as wildfires or storms, etc. Versus density dependent is like competition for food or disease or predation, which these factors increase as the population like becomes bigger. And density dependent factors are generally what contribute to the carrying capacity. But yeah. Any questions on population ecology? So now we'll talk about communities, which are a set of organisms which live in the same area and interact with each other. So yeah, we've basically been going up from like smaller levels of unit organization to larger levels. So we started with individual, then population, and now we're moving on to community, which is like basically just a set of populations that interact with each other. So a niche is a specific role in the environment. And this concept of a niche is like very important to like have down when talking about ecology. So a niche is just a specific role in the environment. It can be like generally includes things like food sources, but also can be like things like where your food or where you're like living in general, like whether it's in the open terrain or if you're living in a forest, or if you're like also you could be like competing for like roosting spots, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, yeah, you can think of like a niche as a specific job, and then all these species are like applicants trying to like get all these different jobs. And so when two species are competing for the same niche, just like for two people like that want the same job, one species will either eventually outcompete the other or find a new niche. So outcompete the other to extinction, or yeah, find a new niche. So yeah, basically two species cannot be in the same niche for the long term. In the short term, they can, but over like a long period of time, one of them will like either evolve to just like be better, or they will evolve into a different niche. And if the other one evolves to be better, then they might get outcompeted to extinction. And this is called the principle of competitive exclusion. Yeah, so they exclude each other from being in the same niche. But we also have something called so two species in the same niche can also avoid competitive exclusion by what is called niche partitioning. So it means that they divide up the niche into smaller niches. So for example, originally, if all of these three warblers were like competing for the same niche of feeding for insects on this tree, then like one of them would like reign supreme and the other two would have to either go extinct or find like new places to like hunt for insects or find new food sources. But instead, they partition the niche so that like the Cape May warbler is always on the top, the bay-breasted is always in the middle, and the yellow-rumped is always on the bottom. And because of this, therefore they compete with each other less. So for example, if there's an insect on the bottom, then it's the yellow-rumped warbler's like food, basically. The bay-breasted warbler and the Cape May warbler are not competing with the yellow-rumped warbler for this insect on the bottom because they have like their own insects like on the top and middle of the tree. And so therefore this reduces competition between the warbler species and like allows them to all coexist on the same tree. So yeah, basically for niches, if there's two species trying to go for the same niche, either they need to find either one of them will go extinct / move into another niche, or they have to find a way to split up the niche. That is called niche partitioning. And here they did it spatially where they're in different parts of the tree, but they could also do it, for example, temporally. So for example, if the bay-breasted warbler only hunted during the day and the Cape May warbler was only active at night, for instance, that would also be a way of partitioning this niche. And so some terms you probably heard about before. I'm not going to go into them. So consumer, producer, carnivore, herbivore, omnivore. And also specifically with consumers, you've primary consumer, secondary consumer, it's tertiary consumer, dot, dot, dot. And then also organisms have different defenses against predation. So camouflage is when an animal blends into the environment to avoid being eaten. Mimicry is when an animal looks like another poisonous animal. And then aposematism is when an animal has bright colors as a warning because it's poisonous. So camouflage is pretty obvious. Aposematism, you can think of the poison dart frog, also known as aposematic coloration. So yeah, like this poison dart frog obviously is not trying to blend into the leaf, but it's because the poison dart frog's bright colors basically serve as a, hey, I am like very, very poisonous, don't touch me warning sign. And then finally for mimicry, mimicry is basically like one organism copies another organism. Mimicry can be Batesian, Batesian, which means a non-poisonous species copies a poisonous species. So for example, I think for one of these butterflies, one of these is poisonous, the monarch butterfly, and the other one is not poisonous. But the not like no predator would want to eat the not poisonous butterfly because they can't really tell if it's poisonous. But there's also Mullerian mimicry where two poisonous species look like each other. And the reason for this is so the predator has an easier time like recognizing which species are poisonous because if the predator had to like learn a new like look for each different poisonous species, it would have to like basically like test a lot more poisonous species and therefore lead to a lot more like deaths of these like insects. But besides yeah, predation and competition, there's also symbiosis, which is a long-term interaction between two organisms. So if both benefit, we call it mutualism. If one benefits and the other one is not affected, we call it commensalism. And if one benefits and the other is harmed, we call it parasitism. Yeah, parasites, pretty obvious. Mutualism, for example, this clownfish lives in the sea anemone. So the sea anemone provides it home because the sea anemone is stinging and the clownfish like has protection against the sting. But then the clownfish can also help lure in food for the sea anemone. In commensalism, basically these remora fish like eat the leftover scraps of the shark, but the shark doesn't really gain anything. So that's why we call it commensalism. Yeah, and then finally here we have a tick for parasitism. And then we have food chains and food webs. In a food chain, the primary producer is eaten. Yeah, so each level, we call it a trophic level. And this is important to understand. So the 10% rule states that each trophic level has to do respiration. And therefore, energy is lost to the environment. Only 10% of the energy is passed on each time. So for example, the plant will get a certain amount of energy from the sun as the producer, but then the plant has to do plant things and burn ATP to do plant things, such as like I don't know, transcribing DNA or like making new proteins. That all requires ATP. So therefore, it will burn some of the energy it got from the sun as ATP in order to do work, or maybe like inefficiencies cause it to be lost as heat. But regardless of this, like this energy will not be stored in the plant because the plant like uses it up. And that means when the caterpillar eats the plant, it's only getting some of the energy that the plant got from the sun. It's not getting like the whole deal, basically. It only gets 10% of the energy. And that means that energy gets lost as you go up the trophic pyramid. So the gross primary productivity is the total amount of energy captured from the sun by plants, but the amount of energy stored in the plant biomass is the net primary productivity. And that's what the caterpillar eats, but then the caterpillar won't be able to like, whatever eats the caterpillar also won't be able to get all of the energy that caterpillar got from the plant, because the caterpillar also like did caterpillar things like move around and like also transcribe DNA, et cetera, which also costs energy. So every step, every trophic level, we're losing like 90% of energy. And this helps explain why there are so few, like, basically there's so many plants and so few of these like tertiary consumers or like top level consumers. And that's because there's just more energy at the bottom of the pyramid. We're closer to the source of the energy, basically, which is the sun. And yeah, besides food chains, we also like, obviously it's not just like a single chain of like organisms eating each other. It's a whole interconnected web. And so different effects on this web can have reverberations throughout the whole entire like rest of the web. So for example, we often call these trophic cascades, but if a single organism decreases or increases within the ecosystem, so for example, like let's say overhunting causes leopard seals to decrease, because fish are consumed by leopard seals. If there's less predators, then the fish population will increase. And if there's more predators for the krill, then the krill population might decrease. Or actually, it's hard to tell in this case because leopard seal also eats krill. So we might actually not know for this one. But yeah, so then the penguin population would increase because there's more food for it, et cetera, et cetera. So we call these trophic cascades, where a single change in one population can lead to the change of like all the other population numbers. Any questions on community ecology before we finally finish up with ecosystem ecology and then move on to um talking or doing like solving practice problems? Yeah. So we've now mostly been talking about like living organisms, but living organisms also interact with non-living parts of their environment. So an ecosystem is the community plus the environment that they inhabit, which is called the habitat, which includes stuff like all these abiotic factors such as the soil, the water, the air, the pH, et cetera, which are contrasted with biotic factors, which are living things. But yeah, specifically, the considering like the non-living parts of environments is important because that's where organisms get their nutrients from a lot of the times. So organisms need different nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, etc., in order to live. And so therefore they have to get these somewhere, either by eating or they, in the case of like things like plants and stuff, they have to get them from the environment. So nutrients aka matter, are always cycled around an ecosystem, including the abiotic environment. So we call this nutrient cycling. You can't like destroy the carbon that's like in a plant, because when you like, even if you like burned it, it would just turn into carbon dioxide in the air, which is part of the abiotic environment. So therefore, like the nutrients just move around, but they can't ever be created or destroyed. And nutrients from dead organisms are often returned to living organisms through decomposers. So decomposers like fungi and bacteria in the soil help break it down in order to like make it into a form that's reusable by the producers. But yeah, so there's many different examples of like nutrient cycling. So for example, in the you probably know about the water cycle already. In the carbon cycle, we've seen respiration and photosynthesis already. Photosynthesis goes from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into like sugar, and respiration goes from sugar to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So these two processes, you can see them here. But we also have things like if like a plant or an animal gets buried, they can turn into fossil fuels, and the fossil fuels will be locked up deep in the earth until humans dig them up and burn them for combustion, which will release them back into the atmosphere. But yeah, you can see the carbon like just moves around and never gets like created or destroyed. There's also the nitrogen cycle, where nitrogen gets fixed by bacteria in the soil, which can then like go into living organisms. On the other hand, unlike nutrients, energy is lost as heat through cellular respiration from an organism. So yeah, we talked about the 10% rule. Unlike nutrients, like all the nutrients like remain in the organism after it dies, but the energy gets lost as it lives. So therefore, energy, we always need new energy from the sun because all the energy is always being lost in the form as heat. Other climate is a big factor that impacts like what species can live where. So climate is the long-term weather pattern of a region, and it's generally dependent on temperature and rainfall. And it can determine what type of biome is, or which like basically the main ecosystem type in a certain region. So here are the different terrestrial biomes by temperature and annual precipitation. You might notice that there's nothing here, and that's because cold air, or basically like there's nothing in the cold high precipitation area because cold air just can't hold a lot of water. Here's another biome map. Succession refers to the gradual development of communities, and it can be divided into two different types. Primary succession starts with bare rock or no soil, just in general. Secondary succession starts with soil. So these are, you can remember S for secondary, S for soil. So yeah, primary succession would be like if like there was a new island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean due to like a volcano or something, then there would be just like lava rock, no soil. So therefore it's primary succession. On the other hand, if there's a forest fire, that's secondary succession, because even if the forest fire like burns away everything, there's still going to be soil left on the ground. But yeah, in both primary and secondary succession, the first species that come to colonize the area, we call them pioneer species. And these tend to be fast growing and very hardy. But as time passes, it will be replaced by more intermediate species. And then finally, when this community stops changing, we call this the climax community. And the climax community tends to be slow growing, but shade tolerant species. So for example, yeah, these shade tolerant oaks and hickories. And finally, we just have to talk about like some like important like human impact on the environment and stuff like that. So biodiversity is the diversity of a species in the environment. And higher biodiversity means higher ecosystem stability, just like genetic diversity. And you might be asked to calculate Simpson's diversity index on the test, but they will give you the formula, but you just do 1 minus like this formula. Keystone species are species without which the ecosystem would collapse due to the dominance of another species. So, for example, in the Pacific Northwest kelp forest like ecosystem, sea otters are keystone species because they prey on sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. So if there are no sea otters, then the sea urchins will sort of grow out of control and eat like all of the kelp, and then the whole ecosystem would collapse. So keystone species tend to be secondary consumers because without them, the primary consumers would eat all of the plants and there would be no more plants. But yeah, so keystone species keep another species in check, and therefore they are essential to the ecosystem, because if they don't keep the other species in check, then that other species will go out of control. Invasive species are non-native species that outcompete native species and have a detrimental impact on the ecosystem. Invasive species tend to reproduce quickly and be our strategists, but one of the special reasons why they are so successful in their new ecosystem is that they don't have any predators. So if you introduce a species with no predators to a new ecosystem, it like doesn't have anything to keep it in check. So, and then it will just like continue reproducing and outcompete all the native species. So for example, this is kudzu, which is like a plant that like is invasive in most of like southern USA because it just like keeps growing and growing and there's nothing there to eat it. Yeah, finally, human impacts on the environment include like greenhouse gases, global warming, pollution, uh, habitat destruction, and overfishing. But yeah, probably know like the gist of many of these, and the details aren't very important for the AP test, because that's like mostly an AP environmental science question. But yeah, does anybody have any question on ecology or any other topic in general? If not, we will do uh some like practice problems. So yeah, here would be an FRQ. Yeah, once you're done, send your answer to me in the chat, send each part one by one, and also send it privately to me so that you don't like spoil the answer for anybody else. And after a few minutes, we'll check in and talk about this problem. Oh, and then also, yeah, for part C, you can just like state the number of triangles, squares, crosses, circles, etc. that would be expected. But yeah, for example, you're like I expect 4 triangles, 3 squares, etc. I'll give everybody till 7:18, so 5 more minutes. I'll go 1 more minute. Okay. Yeah, so I'll start reviewing this problem. So part A says describe a, so yeah, basically they give like the Ambrosia trifida is a type or like an invasive plant, and they're studying like the biodiversity of like plots of land that have a trifida and that don't have a trifida. So A says describe a cause of the logistic growth of the ragweed population. And for this one, let's go back to what logistic growth is. So logistic growth is due to limited resources and like density dependent factors that basically, yeah, cause a carrying capacity on the population. So remember, in exponential growth, the population can just grow forever if there's like infinite resources. But in the real world, like there are like factors that limit a population size, so density dependent factors. So yeah, for you would just have to name basically a density dependent factor that limits population growth in the ragweed population. So you could for example, say that like maybe there's limited water, like there's not enough water for there to be like infinite ragweeds, for instance. And so this would limit the population size and therefore, yeah, cause the whole logistic growth shape rather than the exponential growth shape. Based on the representation in figure 1, explain why scientists claim that plot B would be more resilient to plot A in response to a sudden environmental change. So for this one, you have to talk about biodiversity. So because plot B is more biodiverse, so both more number of species, but also the species are distributed more evenly. So it's not just like 10 of one species and 1 of all the other ones. It's like 4 of each species, for instance. So because the species are distributed evenly, and this means there's high biodiversity. And therefore, if one species were like impacted by like a disease or like some other environmental disturbance, there would be other species that would be more able to like fill the niche compared to with if there's only like 2 species and one of them is like 90% of the population. C says in a third group of seed, basically they removed the seedlings of all plants that germinated before June 1st. And so therefore we want to like draw the expected number of species that would like be in the plot 3 months later. So for this, we have to read the description, and it says Atrifida germinates from early March to the end of summer, while other plants germinate like from late April through the end of summer. Therefore, if you removed everything that germinated before June 1st, you would remove some of both, but you would be removing more Atrifida because more Atrifida germinates early. So therefore, you would draw like sort of like a plot that like sort of has some Atrifida, but also a lot of other annual plant species. So it would be like distributed more evenly. And then finally, D says, explain how invasive species such as ragweed affects ecosystem biodiversity as illustrated in figure 1. So for this, we have to talk about how invasive species outcompete other species, specifically because they don't have any predators or anything to keep them in check. And therefore, they outcompete other species and thus decrease ecosystem biodiversity. Any questions on this practice problem? If not, we'll actually do another practice FRQ. I think this is one of the ones that we skipped due to a lack of time. In one of our previous lectures, but yeah, this one goes back to ATP synthesis and cellular respiration. So yeah, again, once you're done, yeah, this will be like our last practice problem today. And so we'll go all the way to like 29, 729. And yeah, once you're done with each part, send your answer to me in the chat and we'll discuss at Okay, yeah, I think I will start reviewing now. So for A, yeah, basically like they add a compound called resveratrol to like these like cells to see like how ATP production changes. So it says describe the primary advantage for a mammalian muscle cell. Yeah, it says describe a primary advantage for a mammalian muscle cell in using aerobic respiration over fermentation. So for this one, you just have to mention that remember fermentation uses basically like, creates like 2 like ATP per glucose molecule versus cellular respiration can produce like on the order of like 30 something. So therefore cellular respiration just like a lot more efficient per like glucose molecule. B says identify an appropriate negative control. So this one you just have to state that you would do an run a trial without adding resveratrol, because that's negative control. C says predict the effect of short-term ATP production when we don't have glucose or other sugars. So this one it's obviously on like little or no ATP production because we don't have anything to like make the glucose with. And then finally, D says researchers find that resveratrol simulates the production of components of the ETC. So therefore, it will also increase oxygen consumption by cells if glucose is not limiting. And we have to justify their claim. So if you would say something like, if there were more components of the ETC due to the resveratrol, this would allow for more electrons to be like transported in the electron transport chain, which would also reduce more oxygen to water and therefore increase the oxygen consumption of the cell, assuming that glucose is not limiting. So yeah, you have to connect more electrons basically being passed along to equals like more oxygen consumed because the oxygen is like a final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Any questions about this problem? If there are no questions about this problem, yeah, this is our final AP biology class, and I wish you best of luck on, I think it's Wednesday's exam, right? But yeah, if you have any questions, yeah, let me know in the chat, but if not, yeah, just continue doing some more practice problems, especially practices FRQs, but also, yeah, MCQs. All the slides have been posted and all the MCQs come with like answers. So yeah, you can definitely use those for practice. But yeah, I trust you guys will all do very well on this test.
Yeah, thank you for
Thank you.
teaching us. I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
So the first one is, would you be able to post the answers to the FRQ so we can use them to practice?
Yeah, I can try to do that.
Okay.
I'll just like add
And
in an extra slide afterwards and like write up what I would
yeah,
say.
yeah, that sounds good. Okay. And then the other thing is, so I think I asked you a couple classes ago like about the practice test. So and
Oh,
you said that you
okay.
could post them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll try to find one and then post it. Does that sound good?
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for
All right.
coming.
Thank you
Bye.
so much for teaching us. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.